Well, the impeachment hearings are done. Whether for the week or for good, we're still waiting to hear. And today's witnesses drew some of the straightest lines yet, from Donald Trump and his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to the political demands placed on Ukraine in exchange for White House access and military aid.
Our support for Ukrainian democratic resistance to Russian aggression became overshadowed by a political agenda promoted by former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani and a cadre of officials operating with a direct channel to the White House. It was made clear that some action on Burisma Biden investigation was a precondition for an Oval Office visit. My clear impression was that the security assistance hold was likely intended by the president either as an expression of dissatisfaction with the Ukrainians, who had not yet agreed to the Burisma Biden investigation, or as an effort to increase the pressure on them to do so.
What Mr. Giuliani was saying was pretty explosive in any case. He was frequently on television making quite incendiary remarks about everyone involved in this, and that he was clearly pushing forward issues and ideas that would, probably come back to haunt us. And in fact, I think that that's where we are today.
Both witnesses also made it clear that, unlike EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the Ukrainians understood a Burisma investigation meant a Biden investigation, and that military aid would not come until that was announced.
It was very apparent to me that that was what Rudy Giuliani intended, yes. Intended to convey that Burisma was linked to the Bidens, and he said this publicly, repeatedly.
When they received no explanation for why that hold was in place, they wouldn't have drawn that conclusion.
Because the investigations were still being pursued.
Correct.
And the hold was still remaining without explanation?
Correct.
So this, to you, was the only logical conclusion that you could reach?
Correct.
Sort of like 2 + 2 = 4?
Exactly.
Former White House Russia expert Fiona Hill also pushed back on some of the storylines that have been coming from the president's defenders in recent days.
Some of you on this committee appear to believe that Russia and its security services did not conduct a campaign against our country, and that perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves.
Dr. Hill, are you aware of any evidence to support the allegations against Vice President Biden?
I'm not, no.
And as for that infamous phone call between Trump and Sondland, State Department aide David Holmes gave us his take.
I could hear the president's voice through the earpiece of the phone. The president's voice was loud and recognizable. I heard Ambassador Sondland greet the president and explain he was calling from Kyiv. I heard President Trump then clarify that Ambassador Sondland was in Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland replied, yes, he was in Ukraine, and went on to state that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass. I then heard President Trump ask, so he's going to do the investigation. Ambassador Sondland replied that he's going to do it, adding that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do.
So if this was it for good, the Democrats were hoping their two final witnesses would tie a neat bow on their case. Was it tied? Joining me are Nancy Gertner, retired federal judge, a senior lecturer at Harvard Law School. Judge Gertner, it's good to see you. R.J. Lyman's a senior fellow at the D.C.-based think tank Niskanen, did I get it right? Center, and a senior strategist for the Weld presidential campaign. R.J., it's great to see you. Thanks for being here. So, as I said, we may have concluded all public testimony. Did the evidence prove a quid pro quo?
Without a doubt. First of all, it isn't clear that they ever needed a quid pro quo, because if you're going to use American aid, if you're going to call someone and say, do me a favor, interfere in our election, I don't care what else you're offering, that alone. But of course they proved a quid pro quo. They proved it through Sondland's testimony, and they proved it through the president's own words, the inferences from the president's own words. But more significant, Giuliani is the president's agent. His words count against Trump as a matter of law. So they've proved it 6 ways to Sunday.
Well, especially when the president allegedly said to Sondland, which has not been disputed, talk to Rudy.
That's right.
So he was acknowledging
he's my agent. And so the scary thing here is that for the president is that it's not only what the president said, it is everything that Giuliani said, which has got to be crazy.
Were you convinced it was a quid pro quo?
More important than that, Jim, the question in all of this is, what did the president say and when did he say it? And we know the answer. That's the smoking gun, the transcript. We also know with the conversation with Ambassador Sondland, and I'll bet my bottom buck, if the people who haven't testified and the documents that haven't been provided are shown, we're going to see he said the same thing many other times.
Okay, so that seems to be an easy question for you, too. Let's go to a tougher question where the standards are a little murkier. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the definition, as you know, of impeachable offenses in the Constitution. Did he do one of those things?
All three.
He did.
This is dead center. Federalist 68. Spoiler alert, they knew he was coming.
It's almost like they were talking about him if you read that.
Exactly right.
So were you on this? And by the way, we should say that Gerald Ford, when he was in the House, once said his impeachment is whatever we say it is. It isn't the same sort of legal standard that you used to operate in.
But this literally can be fit within bribery. I mean, it is, I will give you this money if you do X for me. It couldn't be any clearer. And then in terms of whether it's actually treason is another question, but it is manipulating the power of the American government. It is manipulating funds that are appropriated for your own personal purposes. I mean, it really couldn't be any clearer, and it really is far worse than Nixon or Clinton.
Why do you say that?
Well, Nixon was arguably internal.
We should say, in the spirit of full disclosure, you have a relationship with
Hillary.
Yeah,
right.
I should say, yeah.
I mean, Nixon is arguably manipulation, manipulation of breaking into the DNC and obstructing that, a crime to be sure. Clinton was, certainly a problem, misconduct in the White House. This is really misconduct of the levers of office. And it's the levers of office. Somebody said this on television, which is you're talking about someone who's engaged a country in a hot war and withholding aid to a country in a hot war. It's like saying, I'm not going to give the money to the police unless you go investigate my partner.
Some of the earlier witnesses suggested that some of the Ukrainians actually may have died as a result of the withholding.
No, this is very different.
Are you still, last time you heard you're a Republican. You're a Republican?
Still am.
Okay, perfect. No, I just want to, because then I want to be, you're the perfect person to ask. Why do you think, I know the eternal Zen question, why do you think not one Republican in the House has even said words, unless they were retiring the next day, that at least I want to hear the evidence. At least I have some concerns. Where are the Weld Republicans in the House of Representatives? Are they all just scared of that tweet, as Dan Goldman said?
In Washington and in much elected office, there are beers and doers. And the people who want to do, whether they're progressive or conservative, is a separate question. But the people who are beers, they just want to stay in office. And I'm afraid in Washington right now, in my party, there are a lot of people like that.
But, I hear that, and I accept that is true, that the only thing that matters is re-election. But 193 out of 193 voted against the resolution in the House. Not one of them has cracked since, despite what I think a fair-minded person. You could disagree on whether or not you don't, on whether or not the president should be removed from office. It's very hard to disagree after 5 days of testimony that there was not a quid pro quo and all the things you described. Why is there not one? I'm not saying why is there not a majority. Why is there not one Republican?
In some ways, Jim, I'm actually the worst person to ask.
Why is that?
Because I'm the one Republican whose very good friend is, in fact, from day one, not only challenging the president, but has spoken out against him.
And he's the only one left, right, on the Republican side?
Joe Walsh as well.
Oh, Joe Walsh, I forgot. That's right.
I think, though, I want to be clear. I'm not sure that removal is a tougher question, Jim. Because what this president has told us, what he has showed us, is he's going to cheat in the next election. So leave it to the voters would be a fine premise if we knew it would be a fair and free election. And with this man involved, I'm not sure we do.
Well, we know he's a Republican. We know you're probably not.
Right.
But you want to comment on that anyway.
The issue for me is whether or not, at this point, it has to be said that what he did was wrong. Period, full stop. That what he did was wrong. So, I think it's clear.
So, I don't know if either of you have expertise in this area. Assuming that the Democrats impeach, and I think the overwhelming sense is they will, there's going to be a trial in the Senate.
Right.
The Constitution, I didn't know this until today, I'm really embarrassed to say, says only this about the presiding person. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. So when the Senate says, the Republican Senate, the majority says, heard our colleagues in the House say we wanted that Hunter Biden to come testify. Forget the whistleblower. That's a tougher question because obviously there's a statute.
Right.
Does the Chief Justice Roberts have the power to say, I'm sorry, you can't get Hunter Biden? He's not relevant to the proceedings?
Certainly could.
He could,
He certainly
as the
could.
presiding judge of the case.
He's the functional equivalent of a judge presiding over it. It's very interesting that the Constitution spelled out that procedure with a degree of specificity that almost doesn't exist anywhere else in the Constitution, which says something about the importance of impeachment. You recognize it's what you said before. Yes, he could be not reelected, but this has to be said that it's wrong. And this is the only way to say it.
One last thing about a Senate proceeding. There was the Hill reported that a number of senators met with the White House today, and I'll read from that report. They said the White House wants the Senate to hold a trial of some length, not immediately dismiss any articles of impeachment with the GOP majority. White House and Trump's GOP allies decided, quote, they want some kind of factual affirmative defense on the merits. Do you know, based on these hearings, what an affirmative defense on the merits would be? Okay, well, that's a quick answer. Can we move on to something that really mattered, but I have a feeling many people didn't watch because they were consumed with impeachment, namely the presidential debate.
By impeachment.
Oh,
right.
exactly, on
right.
MSNBC and the Washington Post. What I decided to do is, rather than just get your general thoughts, play some memorable moments, notable moments from last night from some of the major players. Apologies in advance. We're not doing all 10. We just don't have that much time. I'm sorry for that. Let me go down the list. For the man who, at least in national polls, continues to lead, here's a moment for Joe Biden.
No man has a right to raise a hand to a woman in anger other than in self-defense, and that's rarely ever occurs. And so we have to just change the culture, period, and keep punching at it and punching at it and punching at it. It will be a big no, I really mean it. It's a gigantic issue.
I don't think he knew why people were laughing when he said, no, I really... What's your reaction to that?
That he is completely and totally out of touch. Whether or not that will make him unelectable, who knows, because so, of course, is Trump.
But in a different kind of way,
But
I would
he's
say.
completely out of touch.
What was your reaction to that moment? By the way, that came before another incredible moment when he said he was endorsed by the only black woman who's ever served in the United States Senate. When there was another one, a couple of people to the right. What was your reaction to that thing?
I think the first thing is Joe Biden's a nice man. It's just I don't think anyone disputes that. But I think Judge Gertner has a point. He's yesterday's his best day. Okay, so we have agreement there. Let's go to Bernie Sanders. And he was asked a question about how did you feel about the lock him up chants about directed at Donald Trump. Here's what Sanders had to say.
I think what the American people are also saying is, in fact, that if this president did break the law, he should be prosecuted. At the end of the day, what we need to do is to bring our people together, not just in opposition to Trump.
I assume that means it's fine to chant lock him up. What was your reaction to that?
I think that's reprehensible. I don't think chanting lock him up about anyone is appropriate.
How about you?
I suppose I agree, but I'm so emotional.
There's no agreement there. Let's move on.
I agree.
I'm just going to do this to protect your reputation. Buttigieg, he's only the mayor of a small town, 100,000 people, so his experience was challenged by Amy Klobuchar and others. Here's what Mayor Pete had to say.
I know that from the perspective of Washington, what goes on in my city might look small, but frankly, where we live, the infighting on Capitol Hill is what looks small. I believe we need to send somebody in who has a different kind of experience.
He is surging to leads in Iowa, surging to leads in New Hampshire. Is it that kind of thing that's getting him there? He's a moderate. Obviously, he's Medicare for all who want it, a more moderate position. What's getting him there?
I wonder if it's none of the above is what's going on.
None of the other above.
None of the other above. In other words, it is the weakness of their positions rather than his strength.
Can a mayor of a city 10,000 people smaller than my hometown of Cambridge be president of the United States, RJ?
The mayorship of South Bend, Indiana is maybe smaller than the governorship of Georgia, but if you've been to Plain, Georgia, the man who won election in 76, who was not a good president, but he was a profoundly decent human being, brought us from the culture that with Richard Nixon to even though Ronald Reagan beat him, nevertheless the optimism and the belief in government and the society as a whole is really Jimmy Carter's greatest legacy.
I agree with that. Amy Klobuchar initiated the notion, she said, on this experience front, if there was a woman who had the same level of experience as Pete Buttigieg, she wouldn't be on the stage. Here's an extension of that from Klobuchar.
Women are held to a higher standard. Otherwise, we could play a game called Name Your Favorite Woman President, which we can't do because it has all been men.
I have a feeling you might have liked that one.
I like that one. No, I like that one. There's something to that, certainly. You know, she would have been demeaned as having no experience. But, I mean, the counter to that is Buttigieg certainly is incredibly eloquent and incredibly impressive in his speaking. But whether that translates into content is an open question.
I'm going to skip you on this because I want to get Elizabeth Warren, and not on the wealth tax, which she brought up almost immediately, but an odd point, I thought, I don't mean that critically, she brought up about Ambassador Sondland. Here it is.
how did Ambassador Sondland get there? You know, this is not a man who had any qualifications except one. He wrote a check for $1 million. And that tells us about what's happening in Washington.
What I meant when I said odd is I've had men and women sit here who have given a lot of money and just came back as ambassadors for Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. What do you make of that comment?
The problem isn't Gordon Sondland. Its problem is Gordon Sondland's boss.
Okay, let's leave it there for a second. We only have 30 seconds left. Democrats say, I know you're not one, but you'll weigh in anyway, most important thing to them is electability. Based on 5 debates and a campaign, 2.5 months from Iowa, who's the most electable Democrat, even if he or she is not your choice?
I don't know the answer to that. I think Elizabeth can become electable.
Meaning she isn't now?
Well, I mean, I think that there's now criticism of her. I think she's taken positions in the primaries that will not necessarily, that at least people say won't play in the elections. But she comes at it as a principled visionary, and I think that that will work.
Who's the most electable? I know you're working on the Weld campaign. Who's the most electable Democrat?
I don't think, it's not I don't know, I don't think we know yet. Pete Buttigieg is a good example. Give him a couple weeks with some attacks and see how he fares. Then we'll find out if he's bigger than a 100,000 person city.
RJ, it's good to see you.
You
Thanks
too,
so
Jim.
much. Judge Gertner, as always, pleasure to see you. Thanks.